Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
There would be all kind of trees, plants, insects, and everybody contributed. Let me again emphasize this point. Even insects, they also contributed to the making of this economy. Lak was another example, right? Japan was one of the important importer of lak from the northeastern India, even in the 19th century. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, all the gramophones and everything was expanding, and it needed the huge supply of lak from this eastern Himalaya, right? And this interplay of insects, plants, and the humans together, they all contributed to the making of this new imperial economy, right? The local people really did not benefit out of that, right? Then obviously there were minerals, there were timbers, there were elephants, there were rhinos, there were all such kind of things. Humans and non-humans all collectively contributed in forms of labor, in forms of commodity, in forms of everything. It was a classic example of colonizations, right?
Crucial battles of World War II fought in India's northeast, followed soon after by India's independence and partition, had a critical impact on the making of modern Assam. In the 3 decades following 1947, the state of Assam underwent massive political turmoil, geographical instability, and social and demographic upheaval, amongst others. Later, the truncated state suffered widespread unrest as various groups believed their cultural identity and political leverage were under threat. New social energies and political forces were unleashed and came to the fore. This episode draws from Arupjyoti Saikia's The Quest for Modern Assam, A History, 1942 to 2000, exploring the interconnected layers of political, environmental, economic, and cultural processes that shaped the development of Assam since the 1940s. Together with historian Anjum Hasan, they deliberate on key questions that shaped modern Assam and also the Republic. This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Centre in February of 2025.
I've been personally excited about this book that we're discussing today since it appeared, in fact, in 2023. And part of the reason is that I come from the Northeast, I grew up there, I'm doing some research on Shillong, on Meghalaya, and you can't do that without looking at the history of Assam, because Assam was more or less entirely what once was almost entirely what the Northeast is today. Apart from the princely states of Tripura, Manipur, and Sikkim, what we call Assam in the late colonial period, post-colonial period, was virtually the rest of the Northeast. And the story of how it became present-day Assam from that much more extensive territory, but also a much more multicultural place in some ways, that is one of the many stories you tell in your book, because it extends from 1940 to the present. But that's not the only story. And I just heard Ravi say that you're writing an economic history of Assam. And that would be very interesting because you do tell the story of Assam's journey from being once a very prosperous state to, at the moment, you end in the year 2000. And it's described as relatively poor in relation to other Indian states. So I wanted to start with that, in fact. And as I was thinking of the book, I mean, you can see the size of it. It's a very, very... I'm searching for a word.
I'm so sorry.
It's certainly comprehensive, but it also packs a punch, literally. And so the economic history is only, like I said, it's only one strand. The other strand is present-day Assam versus modern Assam, which is an entity you already had by the middle of the 20th century. So there are all these strands, but as I was thinking about how do I organize this discussion, we can't obviously cover everything, I started thinking of 3 themes broadly, and interestingly, they all start with C. The first one was Cinderella, the metaphor of a Cinderella. And that's very interesting because Assam, like I said, was very rich in resources, has been, still is. And one criticism of people both leading popular protests in Assam in the 20th century, as well as elected legislators, has been that Assam's riches have been extracted and made other people rich, whether in mainland India, whether it's capitalists elsewhere, whether it's the colonial setup. The riches have not gone back to the people. And these were mostly tea, jute, and oil. And all through your book, we keep coming back to this issue of how do you keep the resources for your own people, right? And one of the former chief ministers of Assam in the pre-colonial period, Muhammad Sadullah, he uses this phrase Cinderella, like Assam will become even more of a Cinderella if Sylhet is taken away from her. And that word really struck me because Assam is called Cinderella even in the colonial period. You know, if you read the memoirs of some of the colonials, for instance, Henry Cotton, who was a chief commissioner of Assam, late 1800s, early 1900s, he also says that Assam is a Cinderella, its people are so poor, its peasants are so wretched, and there's a visit of Lord Curzon, and he appeals to Lord Curzon saying, do something for Assam, and Curzon says, it's the weather, you can't do anything, Assam is destined to be a Cinderella. So this idea of a Cinderella as a sort of a mistreated, exploited figure, what would you feel about that? Because there is this very strong sense of Assam, you know, having this, and I'll come to why Cinderella is such a potent image also in relation to India, because, you know, if you have a stepdaughter who's mistreated, then you have to have the evil stepmother, the cruel stepmother who's doing the mistreating. How do you see this theme of Assam's exploitation and its mistreatment, economically especially?
I have been teaching a course called Colonial Economic History of India to a bunch of students who are basically from different kind of training. Many of them are engineers, some are biologists, some are physicists, right? And they are my students for the last 15 plus years, right? And this is the questions that I have been asking them, that whether they have heard anything about the word called colonialism or not. And believe me, that most of these students, they are vaguely aware of this story. They know that India got independence. But what does colonialism mean for an average Indians? It is beyond the comprehension of these students. And I think Shashi Tharoor was aptly right when he went to England to give that talk, which caught the attention of an average Indians and average Britishers. It's not that that history was not told by historians earlier, right? But I think the language and the moment, I think it was important. If I reduce that story, I think it is the classic story of the colonialisms, how it got stage in one part of South Asia, how it got manifested, right from the late 18th century till the major part of the 20th century. Colonialism has many ways of its staging, its avatars are changing in different parts of the country. But Assam or northeastern India, the manifestations took many forms. And I think that impact, right, it shaped the history of many kind of resentment, many kind of unhappiness, many kind of, or say, a deep-rooted impoverishment of that reasons, right, for a long period of time. You know, normally Assam's story is always being seen as a story of tea or oil. These are the two classic examples who is an average South Asian reader would be familiar with. But I think that was not the issue. So as I'm writing the new book, Economic History of Assam after 1947, I really have to think about the legacy, what Assam had inherited in 1947. In fact, you know, this was one of the most important debate in the Constituent Assembly. What would be the nature of the union government and the state's engagement with the question of economy of India? Normally, when we talk about India's constitution, we largely talk about the questions of rights, fundamental rights, directives, elections, right? These are the issues that we talked about. But the constitution makers, they spent quite a substantive number of days on the questions of this income of the states and the kind of situations that India and its provinces had inherited in the 1940s. So to take that back story to Assam's case, Cinderella's symptoms, you know, let me give you some tiny examples, but it has big implications for the story of impoverished man of these regions, but also which benefited a section or a tiny sections of the global entrepreneurs at that time. The classic example, I'm sure, I do not know whether you are familiar with that, is the story of Ficus elastica, the living tree. That Ficus elastica is a kind of tree which was largely grown. There are many variety species of it, but one variety which produced this resin, it was largely used to grow in the wild in the eastern Himalayas and also in the Patkais. When in 1860s, this resin was suddenly recognized in the Western world that this is the resin from where you will be making the rubber, right? Because suddenly in 1860, the automobile industries began to spring like anything. So where from you are getting this gum, right? Which will finally make the rubber. So Assam was one of the reasons, right? Along with other parts of the world. But in South Asia, it was one of the major parts. This particular resin, it will move, it will be collected by the petty collectors. These were basically residents of the highlands, say modern day Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, even Western Burma, right? From the first belt, these were collected from these trees, right? This gum was collected and this will come from those highlands. It will come and meet in the Brahmaputra. It will go to Calcutta, and from there, they will make their onward journey to the European industries, especially France, Germany, and Britain. These were their final destinations. But the benefit, by 1880s, 1890s, most of those trees were cut down. They were damaged heavily. This is what the outcome of development, right? And this was what was happening in 1880s, right? Many British official anthropologists who were traveling through the dense mountain areas into the Burma and other regions, they would found that most of these trees were damaged, they were destroyed because in source of the gum, right? The resins have to be collected. And these were all wildly growing. However, the beneficiary of this entire trade were primarily two sections of the people, right? A tiny group of Indian businessmen, whom we call the Marwaris, right? They were a bunch of people from largely northwestern part of India, right? From belonging to different castes, but essentially they were a very enterprising class of businessmen. As you all know, many of them had arrived in Assam by the late 18th century, essentially a salt trader, right? To sell salt into that regions, but also provider of credit, money, and other kind of commodities to the future British officials, military people. So these were these people who got involved in this trade, in this collection of rubber, the gum, and the subsequent profit. But this involved violence, raid, a lot of atrocities, and also a lot of, deceiving. You have to deceive the people, right? And also the British traders, right? In this entire project, probably my sense is the entire populations really probably did not make a single pie in terms of profit. I do not have an exact calculations, right? There may be some tertiary benefit out of it, but in sum total, the benefit was really, really nominal, right?
What about the land on which these trees stood? Who owned that land?
These are largely the community-owned land, right? Obviously, over a period of... In fact, these were the lands where the East India Company and later on the British government also, they had really loose control. They were not formally, but they were still under the control of the communities, right? Loose kind of control, right? So the Ficus elastica was one such example. There would be all kind of trees, plants, insects, and everybody contributed. Let me again emphasize this point. Even insects, they also contributed to the making of this economy. Luck was another example, right? Japan was one of the important importer of luck from the northeastern India, even in the 19th century. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, all the gramophones and everything was expanding, and it needed the huge supply of luck from this eastern Himalaya, right? And this interplay of insects, plants, and the humans together, they all contributed to the making of this new imperial economy, right? The local people really did not benefit out of that, right? Then obviously there were minerals, there were timbers, there were elephants, there were rhinos, there were all such kind of things. Humans and non-humans all collectively contributed in forms of labor, in forms of commodity, in forms of everything. It was a classic example of colonizations, right? Similar things, colonialism obviously developed, took shape in other parts of India in different ways. But the capabilities of the local people, the economic capabilities, political capabilities, even cultural capabilities were far ahead, or they were at many times. They can rework themselves, they can really negotiate themselves, right? With the East India Company and later on with the colonial government, right? In these matters, I think the social organizations, political organizations, and even the economic potentiality, right? The native wealth, right? It was far behind, right? They could not really negotiate. That's why you'll see that the classic example of the rise of military raids into the hills, so many things happen, right? And all this collectively produce the history of exploitations, right? Classic example, which really do not fit into other parts of India. That's why, sorry, Shashi Tharoor's example, right, is a classic. It fits so well into that. And that's why, the sense of resentments, we could not do anything. That's why and this model, right, also got replicated even 1950s, 60s to some extent. And it took many forms and manifestations.
I don't know enough about the rest of India, but I think, for instance, the Western Ghats, the way in the colonial period that landscape and that ecology changed was also the result of these kind of interventions of the sort that you're describing took place in the Northeast. So I think wherever they found resources that they could use, but are you suggesting that the Northeast was particularly exploited?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, the ability of the local societies to be part of these new formations and the new economy, right, was truly limited, right? Limited. In the Madras presidency, for example, right, because of a long history of trade, commerce, their participation in the Indian Ocean trade and everywhere, right, they had the skills, they had competence, they had wealth, and also the political structures to negotiate with these newcomers, so European trade and commerce, right? Exploitation did not stop, but the benefit also, they could, to some extent, moderately compared to what was happening there. That's why I'm saying that probably the instances of exploitation was more violent, probably in some places, but there can be other similar examples, right?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true, I think, because I'm researching the history of the Khasi Hills, which is sort of became, in the colonial imagination, became part of Assam. And these are the southern parts of the Khasi Hills just above the Bangladesh plains. And the first encroachment of the East India Company there was precisely because of the mineral resources, the limestone. If there wasn't limestone, they wouldn't really have bothered with that neck of the woods. The limestone became increasingly valuable because one East India Company official is poking around there, and he's written a very riveting memoir, Lindsay. And he's climbing up these escarpments up from the plains of Bangladesh, and he sees these limestone cliffs. And he's completely gobsmacked because he realizes that this is better quality limestone than anything in the rest of the country, or even what he's seen back home in England. And that's sort of a trigger to start this mining of the limestone. And it's used in a very limited way locally. There isn't an industrial scale limestone operation at all. But what happens is that they have to do traffic with the local chieftains because they have the rights to what goes on in those territories. So it's not straightforward. And there is research that shows that a sort of a middleman class developed, a local middleman class that sort of was negotiating between these chieftains and the British. I don't know if that really percolated down to the people who were actually working on the limestone, whether it really was a factor in creating a middle class, but some wealth was created locally, maybe only among a handful of elites. But it certainly changed everything. I mean, suddenly there was this whole limestone economy coming down to the plains of Bangladesh, and that whole riverine economy going down to Calcutta. And in fact, a lot of Fort William and all the new buildings that will be made in colonial Calcutta were made with Khasi limestone. So in this book, you focus more or less on tea and oil. I think you also talk about jute. But it'll be very fascinating to read your next book because I'm very curious about what actually happened in these other fields.
My story about the tea in this book, it is not about the colonial story of the tea. It is essentially what happened after 1947. Because we are so engrossed with the colonial tea planters, right? Who were these new planters after 1947? They are not British anymore, right? In fact, most of those British tea planters, they began to liquidate their estates, their wealth and resources by 1940s, early 40s, right? Many of them began to move to Africa, Australia, new destination, new opportunities, right? This began to happen. So it was essentially those Marwaris, right? Marwari entrepreneurs who had learned the art of new economy, right? Who got exposed to this new skill, right? New institutions and also the global development about everything. They slowly began new entrepreneurs. Obviously, the Assamese speaking population also, section of them also they became part of it. A section of the Bengali speaking population also became part of it. But by that time, I think the mass of the profit, it was already taken over, right? So this book is mostly about that part of the story.
The post-independence.
Post-independent
that
story.
brings us to the grievances and complaints that were very much still there, in fact, started developing post-independence. Because even with the oil refineries, for instance, you have this section describing this long debate about where should a new oil refinery in Assam be set up. And there are several now. But this was sometime in the early 60s, I think, or was it the late 50s? Late 50s with Nehru, this back and forth with Nehru. And you hear this impatience in his approach where it's like, what does the location of the refinery have to do with the development of the country? It should not become an emotional issue. But it was a very emotional issue, and there was this feeling that it should be in Assam. If oil is being mined or excavated or drilled from Assam, the refinery should be there. And the solution was then to open two refineries. One in Assam and I think one in Barauni. Yeah.
I think, by 1820s, 1824-25, there is a petroleum reserve in some parts of Assam that was well known to the East India Company officials. But the science was really at a rudimentary stage. They really could not confirm that whether it was that perfect quality which can be used as a fuel and other combustion elements, right? They have to keep on experimenting throughout the 1850s, 1860s. By 1870s, the colonial government, they were absolutely sure that this is the petrol, right? And this was the only instance in the entire South Asia that underground petroleum is available for extraction. So experiments in terms of its extractions, bringing technocrats from America and other places, all these things began. And one of the earliest, very tiny petroleum refinery was established in 1900, right? That story began. But till that time, it is a British company, right? So suddenly in 1953, a new discovery, right? There are billion gallons of oil which is waiting to be excavated. And you can understand, because by this time, Middle Eastern countries, they were oil countries, right? And that oil can make a nation very rich. The people can make you rich. I think that ideas were very much there, right? And I think with the same spirit, with same understanding, there was a jubilation amongst larger sections of the population in that regions that here is the oil which we can extract, which we can convert it into petrol and diesel and other things. We can have an industry and our happy days are coming forward, right? But the big question was, where should be the industry, right? Should Assam has a right over the natural resources? And these were really debates which were shaping at that time. There was no final conclusions about where such kind of interest, who owns the oil, right? Or who owns these natural resources, right? These contentious issues were debated, sorted out, right? But we should also note that Nehru was an extreme believer in a very powerful government, right? And he was pushing for, he and his government, right, that it should be definitely for the nation, right? It should not belong to the provinces, right? So it took some time, right? So, and finally, decision was made that the industry must be nearer to the port, nearer to a metropole. Calcutta must be the first choice, right? But it obviously produced a serious political disagreement. 50s was a classic example where provincial governments were often at odds with Nehru's government, right? Nehru was trying to push for more power in Delhi, but India's provinces were equally powerful, right? And they really pushed it, and after really years and years of negotiations and some unwillingness to bow down to Nehru's demand, finally it was decided an Indian company, rupee company would be formed, and refinery would be in Assam, one, and another would be in Barauni. But what does it tell? It tells many stories. It tells the making of a republic, right? How the republic was made in the 1950s, about resources, about the powers of provinces, about powers of New Delhi, about rights over the resources, and also the aspirations of Indians at that time. All those issues were, I think, highly debated in the 50s, and my book tells about those trajectories.
See, another C, which touches on all these things that you mentioned, the relation between the provinces and the center, regional aspirations, Nehru's interventions, all of these things was also related to another issue that has been especially important to Assam, modern Assam, and that is the idea of citizenship. Who is a citizen? And this, again, is a theme that runs through your book. Assam has seen waves of immigrants from Bengal mostly, starting early. I mean, it's happening all through the 19th century, and it intensifies in the 20th century. And then, of course, you have this enormous migration called Partition, which sort of triggers an en masse migration of people into the regions of Western Bengal as well as Assam. And it's very fascinating that a lot of debates on who is an Indian citizen actually first took place in Assam even before the official citizenship bill in 1955, which was only enshrined into law in 1955 in the parliament. 5 years before that, already in Assam, you're having these debates about how do we decide who should stay and who should go. It really boils down to that. And there was already a law, I believe, in 1950, right? The law about expulsion of the illegal immigrant. It's a very starkly named, very starkly named law. And you mentioned how when this is being debated, which is obviously such a sensitive issue, Nehru actually stays out of the whole debate, that particular debate. And then this is inked as a law, and it's the parliament that is debating this. It's not a state subject. And again, citizenship is something that we could talk about for a very long time. It's all of these issues came back up again in discussion once the CAB and then the CA were being discussed. So I don't want to go into the larger politics. But what I want to ask you in relation to Assam is that there has been so much concern with legal instruments to decide about who is a refugee, who's an immigrant, who's illegal, who's Assamese, who's Indian. A lot of push for having laws instated. But the laws never actually deliver what seems to be the aspiration, which is to create a very clear-cut idea of who's in and who's out. And this, you see this repeated over and over again. When the Assam student agitation starts in the 70s and goes on to the 80s, there are these multiple rounds of talks with Indira Gandhi about how do we decide the cutoff year for who is a genuine resident of Assam and who is not. And just that cutoff year then becomes very contentious, and there's so much debate about that. So to me, it was just a very fascinating gap between debate on the law, this push towards we should have laws, but even the 1950 law, you say very quickly it became defunct. It became like a paper tiger. It was actually used very sparingly, and very few people were actually evicted. So how do you explain that, this sort of obsession with laws, or not obsession, but this faith that the laws will deliver, and in actual fact, you just keep going back to the parliament, going back to the legislator, going back to government saying we need better laws?
I'll divide my explanations into two short, small parts. I'll begin with the contemporary. Contemporary for me would be 1970s and 80s. Then I'll go back to little earlier time, but two distinct kind set of answers. 1971, when the Bangladesh war broke out, right? The war for Bangladesh independence, right? It's a new story. It's all of a sudden, right? From the March 1971 till October 1971, there was a sudden and huge rush of population from East Pakistan to several parts of India, which actually sparked of the debate finally. Things were going on at a different time. But is a big thing. The primary recipient of these refugees, right? Let us use the word refugees, West Bengal, right? And Assam, the state of Meghalaya, which was just formed, taking shape as a political idea. It would be formally declared in few months. And also to some extent Tripura, right? Assam was receiving almost per hour 1,800 people for this entire duration per hour, right? This was an official position of the Prime Minister's office. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, she would visit those areas. In fact, that refugee movement to India, it sparked of a serious crisis for Mrs. Gandhi to get involved in this debate about East Pakistan, and she pressurized the global community also that we need to get involved with this immediately. Now, after the formal declaration of Bangladesh, and what will happen to them, right? Most of these global observers, Indian diplomats, Indian bureaucrats, they all knew that by this time, by 1972, most of these people, they basically got mingle and be part of their brothers and sisters and their families, right? It was not easy. But the official positions Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Mrs. Gandhi took in July 1972, that very soon these people will be taken back. That was the positions that both Mrs. Gandhi and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, they had formally declared in a joint press conference in July 1972. But Prime Minister's office also knew it very clearly. P.N. Haskar, who was Mrs. Gandhi's secretary at the time, right, private secretary, that it is not easy, right? Because how do you identify these people, right? And it is a big humanitarian crisis. Because Assam suddenly received, I said that suddenly, after a brief gap of the 47, right? This would now spark of local political debates, and because by this time you have laws and other things, right? So this intensity of directions, right, against migrants, right, suddenly took a new form, right? It was almost like the sudden crisis in many parts of the world. But, the Bangladesh crisis, the migrations outflow, it was also caused by not only war, but by all kinds of devastations that was caused to that regions, right? Ecological devastations and other kind of devastations that region had experienced over a period of time. I'll come back to that a little later. So between 1980 and 1982, this was the point of contentions between Mrs. Gandhi and the leaders in Assam about the year on from which date we will send back the people back to Bangladesh, right? Mrs. Gandhi was also sure that we should send them back because it is not easy for West Bengal and many parts of India to accommodate such a large numbers of people. Several millions of people arrived all of a sudden, right? Producing social, cultural, and other kind of crisis, both for the refugees as well for the local people also. It was not an easy situation, right? And she was desperately looking for all options to resolve this big crisis. The point of debate was from which year they should be taken back. Mrs. Gandhi insisted that why not 71, right? The people who actually came after 71, right, during the war time, because this was the public promise that she has made with her counterpart with Bangladesh at that time. But the Assamese students who were well versed in the legalities of citizenships, they knew and they read very well about the 1955 Citizenship Act, right? They kept on insisting on that point, that we want all of them to be pushed back outside our country. And finally, it produced Peter violence, right? 1983, that February violence, Nelly violence, all these things. In fact, in the preceding months of Nelly, whether we could have avoided this big crisis or not, in fact, we could have avoided that situations. The issue was whether state government can be in president's rule for a longer period of time, for more than 1 year. In November 1982, it was almost a kind of all-party consensus that we will pass an amendment to the law which insists that it is maximum for 6 months and 6 months and 1 year, and we will extend it for another 6 months. However, in December 1982, the oppositions who had withdrawn support to this promised amendment of this law in the parliament, right? And finally, the government, and obviously government was not interested anymore to negotiate on this issue. Finally, election happened, and the election produced one of the worst massacre in modern history of us, India, I think, I would say, right? Nelly, right? It was definitely no doubt about that. But I think you also refer to this important question of migrations. This has remained one of the contentious, extremely debatable subject over a period of time. But let me just point out one critical point, right? Why so much of people started arriving in, right? I think the story is also about colonialism, right? It is nothing to do with that these people are coming in search of better livelihood or better other kind of opportunities. It was largely a forced migration which took place since the 1860s, right? One phase, it is for the tea plantations and also for the jute cultivations. From 1860s onward, jute emerged jute industry was one of the major industry in India. One was the cotton industry in the Western India, and the other was the jute in the Eastern India. Jute was in huge demand for the global commodity market. You need to pack it, all the packaging, and for everything, jute was in huge demand. So who will produce and where you are going to produce? It is this watery landscape of Assam was seen to be one of the important places. By this time, the people in West Bengal, East Bengal, right? Their environmental situations, their poverty, it had intensified like anything, primarily as a result of this British colonial rule, right? By 1890s, Bengal had reached a point of saturation where you cannot cultivate. There is no land for cultivations. It's a saturate. It has reached a point of saturation. But you were insisting for jute cultivations. They encouraged more people to migrate, moved into the similar directions, and migration occurred, right? And most of the people who migrated, right, they remained poor forever, right? Yeah, they didn't obviously make any profit out of it, right? In fact, in 1929, when the world economic depression set in, it was a horrible situation for them, right? Because by this time, credit, money lending had worsened the situations. It was an unbelievable situation for most of the migrant population, right?
Yeah, I think that's the tragedy, that there is so much of political debate about ethnicity, religion, nationality, but ultimately you have a poor citizenry in East Bengal that becomes Bangladesh, you have a poor citizenry in Assam, and like you say at the end of the book, in many ways, Assam remains a poor state. And to me, that's a story really of a tragedy. I still have one more C to discuss. And that is culture. That is culture, which I think is very, very important to the story of Assam, because it has had in the modern period, certainly all through the 20th century, very energetic champions of its culture. And that started, as you describe, it started getting, as the 20th century advanced, it started getting more and more interested, that group of people, in trying to discover the sort of the Aryan, classicist, Sanskritized roots of Assamese culture. And starting from there, all through the book, in segments, or sort of actually just woven through the story, are these accounts of how the Assamese related to their culture and what they championed, what they defended, what they produced. And to me, that is also equally interesting in relation to the other two things, which is the Cinderella syndrome and this whole debate about citizenship. And you quote a visiting, I think it was a journalist or a diplomat, British or American, who says, Assam does not cultivate its land, it cultivates its culture. So this idea that culture is so important. And I think it's been one of the things you say, which is very interesting, kind of sums it up, is that Assam has had a move to sort of create an Assamese nationalist culture to show things that are exclusively Assamese and which you can draw on for a sense of Assamese identity. But then there's also been the move to relate that to the broader Indian scenario. And in fact, you say very early in the book that Assam was never cut off. It's always been part through trade, through various kinds of encounters. But I think later in the 20th century, also through this imagination of Assam as part of this broader North Indian culture. So this sort of two-track nationalism in the cultural imagination, and I think that's really interesting. But how did that idea of Assam then sit with the fact that it has people from so many different cultures that are part of it? And I think there was a tension there in the whole of the modern period, right? Because you say the whole political scenario, the whole political system became more and more Assamization, right? Whether it was language, the move to make Assamese the language of the state as early as 1960, whether it's producing these histories that enshrine a longer history for Assam, all of this was going on, but at the same time, politically, Assam said, we are all these other segments as well. We are the hills where people may not even speak Assamese, they're from different ethnicities. Even in the plains, there are people who didn't subscribe wholeheartedly to this sort of essentialist idea of Assam. So would you say there has been a tension between this Assamese essentialist sort of tendency and the fact that I think it's one of the most multicultural provinces, has been certainly in the past one of the most multicultural provinces in India? So how did those two things sit together?
For an average resident of Assam and who speaks Assamese, probably he or she would use languages from different kind of linguistic registry. There may be one word from Bodo, one word from Mishing, one word probably from Kashi, one word from Gadu. I would also say that probably their culinary history would also be shaped from different kind of practices of food, plants, or varieties of complex and or multiplicity of culture, right, that is there. So even the Brahmaputra, which is also my favorite subject, right, though it is a Sanskrit name, it has many other kind of non-Sanskrit name, right? And over a long period of time, Brahmaputra used to have such many kind of baptizations, right, in terms of its names and such kind of things, right? This is the peculiarity of that regions, right? However, especially in the 20th century, though the process began of the discovery of the Assamese in the 19th century through archaeological investigations from Rand, and many of them were essentially British investment, right? Most archaeological investigations in the 19th century, they were happening and they were finding only temples. They were not finding other cultures, right? Other non-classical religious practices, right? But at least in the 20th century, the process of Assamization of this complex religious, linguistics, cultural, culinary, everything was becoming more monolingual, right? Or a kind of monoculture, right? If we can bring that metaphor from the forestry, that was happening. And most of these people who were doing it, they were well trained in the field of Sanskrit, a kind of Indo-Aryan linguistics domain, right? So they were really expert and very good in that. They were very comfortable in speaking to a Tamil scholar, is very comfortable to speaking to a Marathi philologist at the time. And through their works, through their control over the institutions, the process of this monolingualism, the rise of one single strain amongst these many strains of languages, right? The process became more and more crystallized. It became more confidence, right? And the institutions which took shape, especially post-1940s, whether it is academic institutions, cultural institutions, right? Or even economic institutions, right? These institutions were slowly gearing up, right? To accept one. But this finally produced many layers of tensions, mostly in the 1970s and 80s, right? Assam's turned out to be a place of wide range of ethnic conflict movements. Let us not use the word conflicts, movements, right? Who would assert their own rights, due rights. It also produced many layers of outcomes, right? Contesting the Assamization process. But the Assamization process also produced an idea that Assam is essentially a part of South Asia, right? Assam is part of an pan-Indian story, right? So that story became firmly integrated. But Assam was at the center of many geographies, right? Southeast Asia, the Eastern Himalaya, deep, say, the Bay of Bengal, right? It was at the center of many such kind of cultural, political, ecological economic confluences, right? But suddenly, I think its geography got reoriented, its outlook got reoriented, and obviously the nation-making process of the post-1947, it gave legitimacy to these ideas in a different directions, right?
I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm always fascinated by historians who marshal a lot of sources. You have at least 200 pages of footnotes and bibliography. It's really a stupendous task. And what I really admire about the book, apart from the range and the scope of it, is how you describe as fully as possible, but you try and keep your own... there's judgment, but there isn't opinion, is how I would put it. You keep your opinion out of it, but you do judge the sources, and you try to present the most balanced view, giving for and against opinions on most issues. But I can't imagine it to have been easy at all, given how many points of... it is also a history of debate, argument, and often conflict, this whole modern history of Assam. So what was the hardest thing about writing this book? What was the most difficult?
The most difficult task was the processing an image of Assam, right? How do I process this image, right? Not about Assam, about the time, right? Obviously, I have not seen it, right? And I have not seen them. I have not seen that time, right? I have only seen it through my archives, right? It's not an easy job, right? And how do I do justice to millions of people, also non-humans, plants and others? How do I understand? It took me really, these are moral, political, and also cultural questions, right? This is one part. Then, these are billions and billions of dots, right? And how to assemble them and then to convert them into a fine cinematography, right? That was a difficult task, right? In our masters, in our undergraduate days, we all learned very complex historical text, right? But, on an average, what I found that an average Indian reader would find our textbooks, right, difficult to comprehend, right? Now, it was also my responsibility to play with the art of the prose, right? It is not an easy thing, right? Most of our poorly trained in the literary language, right? So these two issues, how do I visualize that situations? Then how to convert these billions of archival dots into a cinematographic prose? I think these are two major challenges, what to say and what not to say, right? Because it is not easy, right? And I know that there would be thousands of people who disagree and some people who would agree, right? So I have to also engage with that kind of issues. These are largely conceptual issues, political issues, right? And as you rightly said, right, historians cannot have opinion, right? They must have judgments, right? But I cannot inflict punishment on my past, right? I can, to some extent, on some instance, in some events, I must have that punishment, right? You really did not do well, and you really did not do politically, morally. That was a crime of that time, right? But in most of the issues, I think, to maintain this balance between a judge and a historian, right? I think this was a difficult thing. And I know that my facts have to be correct. My conclusions needs to be largely agreed upon, but they have to disagree on valid points, right? If they are disagreeing, it cannot be merely on the feelings, right? It must be based on certain very strong empirical facts.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.